Hello, my name is Eckardt and I am here today to talk about the work that Philippa, Walton and I recently did at Roman Piercebridge and more broadly about Roman river finds in Britain. Now I apologise that this presentation is recorded rather than attending the conference in person, but this is due to various family commitments and COVID restrictions. Okay, so here we go. So what I want to do in this brief talk is really talk about how we have approached river deposits in archaeology. I want to talk about approaches to the archaeology of Roman bridges. And then I want to present the case study that Philippa and I have been working on at Piercebridge, first of all introducing the site and then looking at the finds that were made in the River Tees. And then I want to end by thinking about how we can understand river deposits in Roman Britain more broadly. Now, the first thing to say is that in prehistory, river deposits are almost always viewed as ritual, and the same is true of the early medieval period as well. And this is very much certainly in Britain influenced by the work of my colleague Richard Bradley, who has written a few books on the deposition of objects in water in prehistory, and they've been very influential. But in the Roman period, any deposition in water has really focused on wells and springs, and deposition in rivers has almost always been seen as non-ritual. Other explanations have been thought for these finds from major rivers. So, for example, for Neupots and Xanten, these are thought to be accidental losses of raiders, trying to cross the Rhine and losing this material. So there has very much been a narrative where Roman material from rivers is seen as an accidental loss during a crossing, either on foot, or on horseback, or by ships. So whole ships sinking. So one model is this accidental loss, and another one is that really all these Roman objects are from eroded settlements. So as the river is changing course, it's eroding settlement deposits, rubbish middens, and also that rubbish would be dumped into the river. And London is a classic example of this, where this is the case. The Thames is eroding settlement layers and middens on a really large scale. There has been a reluctance in Roman archaeology to consider deliberate votive deposits of really quite large deposits and also of small deposits. So we could either be looking at a hoard all put in the river at one time, or offerings made every time somebody crosses, potentially over many hundreds of years. But both of these models have not really come to the fore in Roman archaeology. Another thing that's really striking is that the archaeology of Roman bridges has very much focused on the engineering achievements of the Romans. So, the use of concrete and, the amazing structures that the Romans were able to erect. And it is very striking if you look at reconstructions of bridges. So this is a reconstruction of a bridge in La Tène. It's very moody, it's full of ritual and skulls and offerings, and it really highlights what is special about the bridge. But these Roman bridges are, in their reconstructions, they are often devoid of people. They look pristine, and there is no ritual aspect to them at all. But I believe that to be incorrect. So if we think about the role of rivers and bridges in Roman thought, it is clear that they were significant structures. And you can see here on Trajan's column, you can see the river Danube looking up at the soldiers crossing the river. So there was a need to appease a river god and to placate him as you were crossing. And indeed, the name Pontifex is actually, derived from the word bridge. So the significance of bridges is there in earliest Roman thought. We also, if we look, we find all sorts of apotropaic features on Roman bridges designed to protect presumably the structure from flooding and damage, but also protect the people who are crossing it. And we know that offerings were made when a bridge was constructed, but also when a river was crossed. We often only have hints of these offerings, but we do have them in the written sources. And of course, we have assemblages where there are huge amounts of artifacts, and it's very hard to believe that all of these things are accidental losses. So this is from the Moselle at Trier, where during low water periods in the 60s and 90s, huge numbers of finds were made. And some of these are, complete figurines like the ones shown here, very unlikely to be accidental losses. And there are also vast quantities of coins. Again, that doesn't seem like a normal rubbish deposit. Now, what we try to do at Piercebridge is to use one example to really explore these ideas. And we did this by looking at this site. So Piercebridge is located on a major Roman road north called Deer Street. So Deer Street runs from York ultimately up to Hadrian's Wall. So it's a major route north. And at Piercebridge, there was a range of things going on. Okay, so we have north of the river in an area called Toftsfield, we have what appears to be a civilian settlement. There is also some earlier activity south east of the river at Home House. It has long been thought that there should be a Flavian fort at Piercebridge, because as Deer Street is constructed, one would have thought that that crossing point is guarded by a fort, but there is no clear evidence archaeologically for that yet, although in terms of strategy it makes perfect sense. We do know that there is a fort from AD 170 or 80. So it's a later fort, it's a civilian settlement, and there are a number of bridges at this particular site. Now, since the 1980s, two local men, Rolf Mitchinson and Bob Middlemas, have been diving in the River Tees. They are keen metal detectorists, and they've been diving in this area, and they have retrieved thousands and thousands of Roman finds. And they have retrieved these objects from near the main bridge. So if we look on our plan, you can see in the middle of the picture where it says number 2 with the red circle next to it, that is the main timber bridge that is associated with the course of Deer Street. Now, there is in fact an earlier bridge which was also discovered by the divers, which is to the west. You can see labelled as number 1. Which the divers discovered, and then to the east there is a stone bridge which was constructed in the later 2nd or 3rd century, and when that was constructed, Deer Street was actually diverted, so they realigned the road to cross the river a little bit further downstream, and the area highlighted in the red circle is where most of the finds made by the divers were recovered. Now, it's quite interesting. We were excited to see the information about this earliest bridge. So we have a radiocarbon date, which may suggest that this bridge existed before the Roman conquest of this area, but the evidence is not very clear. So we should say that the divers were not brilliant at recording what they found. They do say that they found some later coins associated with the piles for this bridge, but the radiocarbon date is early. If it is that early, it is quite possible that the earliest crossing at Piercebridge is actually associated with Stannick, which is a major Iron Age oppidum nearby, and where there is a suggestion that a roadway, a trackway, ran from the northeast gate of the oppidum to the river crossing of the Tees. So it's possible that this is a really early bridge. It's equally possible that it was built in the during the early Roman occupation. We then know that by at least AD 90, the main bridge on Deer Street was constructed. We know this from looking at the date of the settlements associated with the road. The bridge itself is not really dated, although there are two radiocarbon dates for 2 timbers. Now, again, it's quite unfortunate that while we have sketch plans from the divers, when you look at them in detail, all the posts move around and it's quite difficult to get an accurate picture. And it looks to me like there are actually multiple phases of bridges there, which seems quite likely because obviously timber bridges would have to be rebuilt regularly, especially in a river like the Tees, which is fast flowing and prone to flooding. As I said, the records are patchy. So while they did record where they, so again, you see Deer Street running north-south, and you can see they've labelled areas and they've made sketches of artifacts, but the labelling of the areas keeps changing and it's very difficult to match anything to its find spot. So most of the material is effectively unstratified. However, what they were really great about is communicating with Philippa Walton, who was at the time the finds liaison officer for the region in the early 2000s. And so that the finds liaison officer records finds that are found by metal detectorists. And she was able to persuade the divers to hand over all this material and to record it. It's a monumental achievement. And you can see here the kinds of records that were created by Philippa and by a huge number of volunteers. There are 3,600 objects in total, and there's also pottery and animal bone. Okay, and I'm going to hand over to Philippa here.
As Hella's already mentioned, approximately 3,700 objects were recovered from the bed of the River Tees at Piercebridge, and I'm going to talk to you more about those now. Now, all these finds were recorded on the Portable Antiquities Scheme database, and you can see here 2 of the object records that I completed. Over the course of 18 years, I recorded all the objects there with the help of a considerable number of volunteers. Now, the advantage of using the Portable Antiquities Scheme database is that you can record individual objects in great detail. So you can include a description of the object, the image of the object, and discuss parallels, dating and function in quite some length. We didn't feel we'll be able to do this in a print format, so it's a tremendous opportunity to provide a very full digital archive of the river assemblage. Our publication, which is now in print, complements this online catalogue and concentrates more on the interpretation of the objects rather than their cataloguing. So what can these objects tell us? Well, first of all, we can concentrate on their dating. And as you can see, they range from the Iron Age right through to the post-medieval period. The earliest object is an Iron Age mirror handle, and the latest are molting floor tiles from the post-medieval period. But as you can see, there's a considerable concentration of Roman material. Coins make up nearly a third of all the Roman objects recovered from the river, and they date from the 1st century BC all the way through to the 5th century AD. However, there's a clear emphasis on material deposited in the Antonine period and the Severan and late Severan periods. This is in complete contrast to the material excavated on the site at Piercebridge throughout the 20th century. And this coin assemblage was reported on by Richard Brigstock in the 2008 excavation report. Here you can see that the emphasis of the coin assemblage from the site is on the late 3rd and 4th century, whereas the material from the river dates to the 1st to the 3rd century. And even just by looking at the coins, we begin to realise that there must be something different going on in the river at Piercebridge. Perhaps different processes of deposition are in play. This is also echoed in the small finds assemblage, where the objects could be relatively closely dated. It was clear that the excavation assemblage and the river assemblage also differed quite substantially. Again, the river assemblage dates mostly to the 1st to 3rd century, with this massive peak in material in the 2nd and 3rd century AD, whereas the objects from the excavations are really late 3rd and 4th century in date. And again, we're looking at different processes of deposition here, or at least something very odd is happening in the river that isn't occurring on the site. The early to mid-Roman dating of the coin and artefact assemblage is also reflected in the C14 dates that we recovered from animal bones from the river. We had 5 samples dated and all came back with dates between the 1st and the 3rd century, with again that particular emphasis on mid-2nd to 3rd century dating. So the coins and objects have given us some indication of the dating of deposition in the river. But what can looking at the objects themselves in more detail tell us about the identities of people who were living and working in Piercebridge? Well, there's a remarkable range of object types represented by the material recovered from the river. They include items of personal adornment, cosmetic and medical instruments, as I've already said, lots of coins, figurines, but also a huge amount of military and equine equipment. For instance, there are more harness fittings recovered from the river at Piercebridge than from any cavalry fort in Roman Britain, and the second largest number of lead ceilings was recovered from the site at Piercebridge. Also, there are several objects that are either unique in a Romano-British context or extremely rare. So what we're dealing with here is a remarkable assemblage for looking at Roman material culture in northern Britain. Rather than trying to go through each functional category and describing objects in turn, I'm now going to concentrate on just a few objects to think about the identities of people who were living and working in Piercebridge. Although there's a clear emphasis on 2nd to 3rd century material amongst the objects recovered from the river, there are some indications of earlier activity at the site, and these come in the form of several objects dating to the 1st and 2nd century AD. They include this cosmetic mortar here on the left, nail cleaners and brooches such as this Nauheim derivative. And all these objects seem to be the possessions of people who wanted to express a peculiarly British form of identity at the site. However, the majority of the material is associated with the mid-Roman army, particularly with items of military address and the sword belt. They include belt mounts, belt plates and strap ends. Comparable fittings are almost completely absent in the excavation archive from Piercebridge, but at 79 belt fittings and 44 strap ends, the river finds appear to represent one of the largest assemblages of such objects associated with military dress found from any site in Roman Britain. This would suggest that there's something very unusual about the manner in which they came to be deposited. Given the symbolic significance of the belt, it seems likely that these objects were deliberately deposited by individual soldiers, and comparison with assemblage from other sites has indicated the selection of particular elements seems to have occurred, with things like strap ends and open work belt mounts particularly well represented. There also seems to be an extensive cavalry element activity in the river, as 147 items of horse harness were recovered. Although horse harnesses were not the exclusive preserve of the army, the size of the assemblage from the river and its association with other items of military equipment make it likely that these items are military in nature. Now, harness fittings like these apotropaic studs, harness pendants and strap slides probably acted as symbols of cavalry identity in the same way as sword belt fittings did for the infantry soldier. Women are also strongly represented amongst the assemblage, with objects such as bracelets, hairpins and earrings, and there are also hints of children being present, particularly in small child-sized bracelets and things like lead phallic pendants, which are often found in child's graves. The finger rings are surprisingly dominated by smaller sizes, and this suggests also the presence of women and children, or perhaps younger male servants, unless of course men were wearing the rings on the upper joints of their fingers. The majority of these finds associated with women and children date to the 2nd or early 3rd century AD, and this coincides with the dating of the Roman military finds from the site. It therefore seems likely that the women and children represented by these artefacts were in some way connected with the military community and included wives and relations as well as tradeswomen. Several of the objects give the impression of a tremendous injection of wealth and people into Piercebridge in the later 2nd and 3rd century. Particularly striking is the amount of gold jewellery recovered from the river, or fragments thereof. These objects would seem to suggest the presence of wealthy, high-status women hailing from the upper echelons of military society. And these women appear to have had links with the provinces of Germany, Moesia and Thrace. There are at least 3 items of jewellery like this fragment of an earring, which are best paralleled by examples from these provinces. It's interesting to note that some of the items of military dress also suggest that a proportion of troops depositing material had links with the Danubian limes. Many of the belt fittings from the river are particularly associated with that region, and several are the first examples to be found in Roman Britain. These links are strengthened by other finds, including examples of continental knee brooches, which are apparently imported from the Danubian limes, and also a lead votive plaque of a type more commonly found in Pannonia. Now, just to summarise, we have activity from the late 1st century AD with an explosion in the late 2nd or early 3rd century reflected in the objects, and this is not paralleled in the material found in the excavation. There are objects associated with soldiers, both infantry and cavalry, as well as the wider military community. There's a strong female element to the assemblage, with many of the most valuable objects belonging to women or children. There are the hints that the troops or their families may have come from Germany, Moesia and Thrace. And also the large quantities of objects, some unusual items, and the presence of so much precious metal suggests that we are not just dealing with rubbish. So now we have to try and think more about what we are dealing with. And I'm going to pass you back to Hella to think about the implications of that question.
Thank you. So back to me. So the key thing really that we wanted to do, apart from identifying the identities of the people who deposited these objects, is to work out whether we could say something about whether these artifacts from the Tees are ritual or rubbish. And one way we thought of doing this was to compare the assemblage to the material from nearby excavated sites. So Philippa has already shown some of the information on the coins, for example, and their chronological profile and denominational profile clearly varies. And the chronological profile of the small finds also varies. Now, what we've done here is correspondence analysis. So the idea is that you can look at a number of sites. So the Piercebridge River in the bottom left, Piercebridge excavations in the bottom right, Catterick and Binchester, which are nearby military sites, and you can see in the orange dots the types of objects which are predominantly found on these different sites. And what that shows is that Piercebridge River is behaving differently to the other sites. We have more of certain types of objects than would perhaps be expected to be the norm. And Philippa has already shown we have more of certain aspects of objects as well, like the belt fittings, for example. So I think that is an indication that while some of the material, such as the animal bone and pottery, which behave very much like the material from the excavations, some of this material might be rubbish that's eroded from middens or tipped into the river from the bridge, but a lot of it appears to be deliberately deposited. I mean, I should say this is not an exact science. So, for example, if you look in the bottom corner, agricultural equipment actually also includes fishing weights, which obviously are more likely to be found in a river. So you have to be a little bit careful with this. But I think methodologically it's really quite important, because what it allows us to do is to look at an entire assemblage to try and understand what is going on. Now, we also worked with an artist called Aaron Watson to make a reconstruction image of Piercebridge, and we've tried to take these ideas that I showed you right at the beginning about Latin and prehistoric or medieval bridges and translate them into the Roman period. So to make a deliberate point about A, the fact that these bridges might not be that pristine, B, that people are using these bridges, and C, that they might be engaging in different types of ritual while they're using the bridge. So it's a deliberate statement. This image is making a point about that. We're also really proud to say that our book is now out, so you can buy the book for, at the moment, £25 and otherwise £30, which is, I think, a really good price. You can order it from Oxbow Books, or you can access it completely free as an open access PDF file at the link provided here. I want to just very briefly end to say that we also wanted to think about river deposits more widely. So we're currently running a project where we're collecting together all the evidence. So, you know, there are things like heads of statues found from rivers, like the head of Hadrian on the left here from the Thames. But there's lots and lots of other material that people have never really looked at. So we're making a huge database. We're getting all the sites together. This is South Shields, where military equipment was found in the River Tyne, for example. But we're also cross-checking the evidence. So sometimes this is a silver vessel hoard, which is said to be from a river, but actually when you look at the detailed report, it doesn't come from a river. In some cases, a river channel has moved, for example, or the antiquarian records are difficult to interpret. So what we're hoping to do in the next project is to create a comprehensive record of all the Romano-British river finds and to critique them, to see whether they really are deposited in the river, the range of material, the chronological profile, and to look at the environmental and fluvial context. So where the river channels have changed, what can that really tell us about what was going on? And I think that has been really missing from previous work. And then we also want to compare these Romano-British river finds to material found in a, say, 3-kilometer radius. So are they, or 5-kilometer radius, are they behaving differently? Are there different things in these rivers than there are found nearby on land? So watch this space. We're hoping to put an application in for this this year and to carry on this work. And overall, obviously, our idea is to really think about what river finds tell us about people. And I'm going to end by just saying thank you to the divers and all the various funders of our work. Thank you very much.